Well, it's interesting because I don't consider the work that I do here in any way separate from my childhood, my growing up. It's all very, very connected. And I think my youth, my childhood certainly has a lot to do with where I find myself today and how I look at the world and how I hope to engage with students. And I grew up in Buffalo, New York, just outside of Buffalo, New York, and grew up. Now I realize, I mean, then I'm not sure what I knew, but we were poor, definitely poor, and I remember times when my mom, when I was very, very young, we didn't have enough to eat, and so she'd have to try to go out and ask neighbors and other folks if they could help us out, and those memories stuck with me, obviously. I remember we were so poor at one point that for a dessert, she was trying to give us something sweet to eat, and so she took a loaf of white bread, I assume that she had gotten from a neighbor, and cut it up and put it in a bowl of milk and put sugar on top, and that was our dessert. And as a kid, of course, it was such a treat, but now I look back and I think how my folks really, who were both, neither of them have more than an 8th grade education, and so they were poor themselves, and I think we gradually moved out of the working class, the poor, and then into the working class, and then probably into lower middle now, I realize that. But I think in many ways those class experiences really totally shape me. And even though I'm not working class anymore, I think that you never lose that. You never lose that perspective. You never lose that perspective on the world. Sometimes there might be days when you forget it a little bit, but you never really lose it, and it frames everything I do. My dad he came to the U.S. from Italy in the 1950s, and so first generation, he was a non-English speaker. And I think that also helps me relate in a lot of ways to what's happening at Cal State East Bay and why I love it here so much. I've been here now for 17 years and got here in '98. So that I think his experiences and growing up in the household was really sort of framed me today. Let's see, what else? When I was, since my folks didn't have a high school education and no one in my family had gone to college, I didn't really have a model. Like I could tell that my teachers and my coaches had gone to college, and they became my model because I didn't have anybody in my family to guide me into college. I didn't know what that looked like. I didn't know how to go about it. But my mother especially was the one who said to me, if you want to go, then we'll make sure you get there, which now especially I realize what a major sacrifice that was for her. I don't think as a 17-year-old I quite understood that. And so I went to a small school in Pennsylvania and got an undergraduate degree in physical education and thought that I would teach PE for the rest of my life. And that was going to be a fine occupation. I think I would have loved it. And then I realized that when I got to Edinburgh State College at the time, which was my undergraduate institution, one of the things that worried me a lot is that since I didn't have college as my experience, no one in my family could speak to it, I really didn't know if I belonged on a college campus. I felt like there was no one else. I didn't feel like there were many people around me like me that came from the background that I came from. And so for my freshman year and into my sophomore year, I thought, God, do I really fit here? But then I realized that the faculty members at Edinburgh were really supportive of me. They took time with me. They made me feel like, yeah, I'm a working class kid from Buffalo, New York, but I deserve to be there like anybody else. And so I did my undergraduate degree there, and then got a kind of an itch for intellectual stuff. Realized I wanted to stay at the college level and continue to teach at the college level. And so I got a master's degree in athletic administration. Wasn't quite sure what I would do after that point. Was lucky enough to get a job at a small college in Ohio right after my master's degree and taught there for a few years. And that's when I really began to sort of have my consciousness around a number of issues was raised at that point. As I said, I think I've always had a class-based consciousness about me. But as a teenager, sort of quickly realizing that I was a lesbian and identifying as a lesbian, and that became, obviously, as I grew into young adulthood, a major part of my life. And I was sort of beginning to connect the dots around marginalization and oppression and bringing, as Bell Hooks once said, bringing practice to theory. Like, oh, all these experiences I've had in my life, now I'm laying the theory on top of it that I was learning in graduate school. Like the light bulbs are going on all over the place. And so I decided to pursue a PhD at the University of Iowa, where I could study feminist theory, race theory, and sport. And because sport had been a part of my life for as long as I could remember, being physically active had always been a part of my world. So I got to go to a place where I could do both of those things, and I thought, oh my God, could it get any better than this? And then in '98, after I finished my PhD, I was offered a job here, and I remember the first day on the campus. I remember the interview day. It was early March of 1998, and they took me over for a little lunch. Then the old Union was really the only place you could get anything to eat on campus at that point. There were no Starbucks, no nothing, right? And I was sitting in the cafeteria there and surrounded by any number, hundreds of students at that point. It was a cold, rainy day outside, so everybody was in. And it was noisy and great, and I heard probably 10 different languages that day spoken around me. And having lived in Iowa for 8 years, which is a kind of a sea of whiteness, coming to the Bay Area and sitting in that place and thinking, oh my God, this is the place I want to be. And then they called me a few weeks later and they offered me the job, and I have to say that it has been one of the, teaching here, it certainly comes with its challenges, which usually aren't about students, comes with some other challenges, but I think that, and people say this and it can sound so cliche, but it's really the students that makes this place happen. And it's for those of us that, for especially I think coming from a background that wasn't privileged in terms of all of my identities. Certainly my whiteness is privileged, but my other identities weren't. And I think coming here and getting to work with students whose backgrounds in some ways are a lot like mine, first generation, parents didn't speak English, poor, first in the family to go to college, I think it all hit for me, and it really allowed me to do some of the work that I do in the classroom around social justice. All my work is really around social justice. I think it doesn't make it easier, it makes it very different than some other places I've taught. And I think it can be a much more enriching experience. Certainly has been for me, and I hope it's been for the students, because their perspectives, what they bring to the classroom is so diverse and so incredible, and so global, that it just makes for really a fun time in a classroom when you're talking about power, politics, and identity. It can make it really both a challenge and an incredible experience. I think the social justice work that we do in the classroom, and fortunately the courses that I teach and the way that I approach it is just, at its core, is about social justice. And so that, I can't imagine not doing that. I don't even know what that would look like. And so doing that here has been really a really cool experience. I think for the last 4 years, the Center for Sport and Social Justice there's a university center that we launched, a colleague and I launched 4 years ago, has just added to the kinds of work we can do in the classroom. We bring speakers and events to campus, and it just helps to bring some of the ideas we're presenting in the classroom to life in a little different way. And I think that that's been really enriching, and often you hear folks say that, you hear students say that what they learned in a classroom, and for me it's almost every day it's the reverse. It's always what my students bring to the classroom and what I learn from them. And even today, sitting in my sport history class, which is an undergraduate course that I teach, and it's pretty much my load, it's my expertise. I love the fact that I get to teach so much of it here. I teach it to majors, I teach it to general education students. And the course is basically about sport, but it's really about identity. It's about the way power has played out in history around those identities and what that's meant to sport. So for example, how we see racism and issues of race and sport across time, how we see the same thing in terms of gender and sexuality and class and religion and the body, etc. And so getting to teach that course every quarter, lots of quarters, is great. And the project that we do in there is an oral history project where the students have to interview someone who's at least a generation older than them, and I really prefer that it's family because it makes a different kind of project. It brings it closer to them, I think, makes it more personal, which I think is important. And so in my class for the last 15 years we've been doing this thing, and I can't tell you the kinds of responses we get, given the diversity of our students. So here they are, they go off and they interview someone in their family a generation older than they are. And they come back with stories that are stories from around the world. And over much of the 20th century, now it's really the middle part of the 20th century, but so these stories, I can have 4 or 5 different continents represented in any one quarter. I can have 20 or 30 countries represented in one quarter, as well as lots of states from around the United States. And so what we end up talking about in the classroom are the ways but these stories are really, really different, of course. So someone raised in the Middle East in the 1950s, a Palestinian in the 1960s is going to have quite a different story than maybe someone growing up as a white person in rural North Dakota or something. But so we talk about those differences, but we also talk about the threads that link all these global stories together. And that, I think, is it's a great experience for me. I think it's a lesson for me every time I teach the course, and how our stories, while they are remarkably different, can also have links between and among them, and that's important for me to hear, and I hope it's important for our students to hear, as well as, of course, learning about the real differences in the way people were raised and what their experiences in sport or physical activity or leisure looked like as a result of the worlds that they came from. So that assignment here is so much different than it would be anywhere else, and it's the way that I can bring sort of social justice and issues of diversity and equality to the classroom, and kind of make it real, even though it's obviously real, it's their family that you're talking to, but to make it real, like quarter after quarter, year after year. I love doing that here. I hope I can do it for the next however long they keep me here. That'd be great. And I think when I frame successes for me, it's always around my classroom. I could talk about the events we've done with the center, but it really comes back to the class. And the successes for me are watching students move from, especially with this oral history project, where they attempt to put the experiences of an older generation person and their family into the context of the historical moment and make sense of their leisure experiences. And I think it's at the end of the quarter when the students reflect on the assignment and first of all, they tell me about what they learned about their parent or their great uncle or something that they had never known before, and how it actually gave them a moment where they could talk to this person. They might not have ever have had the opportunity or the desire or whatever, the reason, to sit down and chat with them about their past. So some of it isn't like an intellectual thing at all. It's actually a very personal thing about sitting with someone who's older than you and having their experiences be the focus of your conversation. And listening to my students talk about that and what they learned from it is really powerful. And listening to the students talk with each other about what they're learning across their very, very distant family and very diverse family differences is a really, really powerful moment. You see light bulbs going on all over the place, and smiles and laughter, and it really feels as though it's a different kind of learning that's taking place. And I would say if there is a single success story that I would sort of talk about, it would be watching the students engage in that project, especially at its end. I think some of the challenges around teaching issues of diversity and social justice are many. I mean, and I think when I think about over my years of teaching, the challenges haven't really changed that much, but I think my reaction to them has changed a great deal. I think for some students, teaching the material we teach, as I say to them on the very first day of class, intellectually, I know they can all handle it. I know they can handle the theories we throw out and we discuss and the materials we talk about. But what's really, really difficult is the way having discussions with people that you don't really know about issues of social justice impact you personally. It can be very painful, it can be very hurtful, you can feel offended, you can feel marginalized, you can feel silenced. All those things can happen. I hope that obviously they don't happen to students in that way, but they can. And I think watching students sort of work through that can be a very, very difficult thing to watch, and trying to work through both individually and collectively with a group of students, work through the issues that come up for them either on an individual level or as a sort of part of a larger collective identity, I think is important. But those conversations, as hard as they can be and as challenging as they can be, I think can really be great, learning experiences. I remember when I was very, very young and I was a student in a classroom, one of the most challenging moments I've had as a student, and I try to use this when I'm thinking about the way I'm teaching and what students are hearing on the other end. I was in a room, it was a graduate class, and it was a room on, I was doing my dissertation on African American women's sport history, and so I was taking a class on African American women 20th century, right? So a generic class. And it was a room of about 25 people, and I was the only white person in the room, which was, as a white person, an unusual situation for me to be in, and one that I know people of color deal with all the time, but as a white person, this was my first experience. And I don't actually remember a lot of the content of the course. What I remember are my the difficulty I had in that class with coming to I don't want to say grips, coming to realize my own privilege as a white person, and having that play out every day in that classroom. Ways in which I was using my privilege that I really shouldn't have been, had no business doing. The entitlement I brought into that room that I didn't even realize I was doing. And so it was a process of it was difficult. It wasn't easy, but it was ultimately one of the best classes I've ever had in my life. It helped to change. I'm still working, and I never quite feel like I'm good at anything, but especially when it comes to those sorts of things. But I think it showed me that it is a difficult process for students, but it can also be like really rewarding as well, and I hope helps me be more reflexive, both as a teacher and just a citizen of the world, right? So that was I try to think of that when I think about the challenges that I see my students going through every day when we talk about these kinds of things. Whether it's white folks feeling marginalized or the people of color in the room feeling as though they're marginalized as well, and wanting to try to negotiate all of that, and knowing that it's certainly probably not easy for them. It can be a challenge as an instructor to make that all happen in a way that people feel like they leave with a voice that's been respected and not like trashed or marginalized. So I think what I would communicate to others who are wanting to do this work or eager to do it is probably what most instructors already know, and that is, but can be difficult to do, and I think that's giving the students much more voice in the classroom and giving them much more power to create the kind of learning environment they want. Obviously, I'm guiding them through that, but that was one of the things that was really difficult for me at the beginning of my career, was to let some of that go and to let the discussion go at times. Sometimes when it got a little uneasy, it got a little uncomfortable, I would pull it back too quickly, and I think letting it go, and this is a fine line, right? You don't want to let a class discussion around really hard issues go too far, but just knowing that the students, for the most part, I found, do a really, really good job in negotiating their differences in a classroom, whether it's different perspectives, whatever it might be. They do a wonderful job navigating that, and I think over the years I've tried to figure out ways to empower the students more by enabling their voices to be the core of the class, and not let my voice sort of dominate the way the classroom goes, the way the class activities go. That's been really, really a cool thing for me at Cal State East Bay, and I think, again, it's because of the students we have here. They're articulate and wonderful and great, but they're eager to talk about their experiences, and I think everybody learns when our students do that. So I would encourage any faculty to sort of work in those directions to make that happen as much as you can.